Thank you for joining us tonight for this special session of the Tacoma Park City Council. I'd like to call our meeting to order right now. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember Kovar.
Here.
Councilmember Dabala.
Present.
Councilmember Kostick.
Here.
Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Smith. Councilmember Searcy.
Here.
Great. Thank you very much. So tonight we have a special meeting to discuss the pending Montgomery County Building Energy Performance Standards. And I'm going to turn it over to our sustainability manager, Gina Mathias, in a moment. But first, I just want to really thank all the folks who are coming here tonight to present and answer questions from the county DEP. We really appreciate you spending your Monday evening with us to go through these tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to Gina so she can introduce everyone and we can get underway. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Stewart, and thank you, Council, for this special meeting, and thank you for the Montgomery County staff who is here with us tonight. With us tonight, we have Lindsay Shaw, Emily Curley, and Stan Edwards from the Montgomery County Department of Environmental Protection to walk us through the proposed Building Energy Performance Standards legislation. This is a major change to Montgomery County's existing building benchmarking law that has been introduced to the County Council. The proposed legislation, as it currently is proposed, could apply to 26 buildings in Tacoma Park. Building performance standards are laws that require existing buildings to meet energy performance targets. The BEPS, Building Energy Performance Standards, would offer a way to meaningfully reduce greenhouse gas emissions while lowering operating costs, creating local jobs. The city is already subject to Montgomery County building benchmarking law, and we would automatically be opted into the BEPS law should it be adopted. The county's proposed ordinance applies energy use intensity standards that the county staff will explain in more detail shortly. It would apply to all county-owned commercial and residential buildings 25,000 square feet and larger. This ordinance would apply to 26 buildings in Tacoma Park, including 16 multifamily buildings, 2 churches, schools, and several office buildings. This would cover 2.8 million square feet of building space in Tacoma Park, which is a significant increase from the 750,000 square feet from just 7 buildings that are currently covered by the existing benchmarking law. The county staff has undergone an extensive stakeholder work group experience and has met with City of Tacoma Park staff, including myself, the economic development manager, the housing development manager, and a number of building owners across Montgomery County before they developed and as they're considering the BEPS legislation. In the context of Tacoma Park, the 2020 Climate Emergency Response Framework Resolution, City Council identified establishing minimum energy efficiency standards or scores for all feasible building types within the city as a priority strategy to help us meet the net zero greenhouse gas emissions goal by 2035. City Council also specifies the goal to establish a program within a decade and to bring the least efficient buildings up to an average using nationally established tools. The framework further specifies which building types could be covered, including multifamily buildings with 20 units or more, non-residential buildings of 10,000 square feet or more, with recommendations for smaller and non-residential buildings as well. Given the amount of technical expertise, the amount of outreach, staff time, and financial assistance required to implement a building energy performance standard, I feel it is in the city's best interest to support the Montgomery County staff and the County Council in administering a BEPS law, as Montgomery County establishes this new model for building energy performance standards with all of the necessary support systems. Tacoma Park can advocate for additional classes of buildings to be added in future amendments. And this directly applies, of course, to Tacoma Park's council priorities of an environmentally sustainable community in a number of areas. The goal in climate change mitigation work and work towards a net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2035. This would help to prioritize and accelerate priorities and programs that implement the 2020 Climate Emergency Response Framework, specifically for strategies on buildings and reduction in fossil fuel usage and renewable energy. This would coordinate and advocate for climate change mitigation and resiliency and sustainability within the county, and integrate city climate goals and strategies with other city policies and programs, including economic development and housing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay Shaw, who is the manager of energy and sustainability programs in the Department of Environmental Protection with Montgomery County.
Great. Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Mayor Stewart and esteemed council people. I appreciate you hosting DEP this evening for this special work session. Gina gave a great overview of our presentation, so you might be hearing a lot of what Gina said again, but I'm going to share my screen and go through a PowerPoint slide deck that I believe all of you have a copy of, but if not, you'll have it up on the screen. So we are here, myself, Stan Edwards, and Emily Curley, to give an overview of building energy performance standards, which is currently pending in front of the Montgomery County Council. So building energy performance standards is cleverly shortened to BEPS. So I'm going to say that quite often in this presentation, so defining that right up front. So how did we get to this point in our legislative journey? I think that a lot of the folks in this meeting are very familiar with the county's climate goals already. Gina gave a good overview there. We've been tracking our greenhouse gas emissions inventory back with our 2005 baseline. And then we have approximately every 3 years, we do a greenhouse gas emissions inventory courtesy of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. They also prepare the City of Tacoma Parks GHG emissions inventory. When the County Council declared a climate emergency in 2017, it accelerated our GHG emissions reduction goals to strive for an 80% reduction by 2027 and a complete elimination of greenhouse gas emissions by 2035. So if you're looking at that 2018 dot here, that's the most recent year that we have data for. We've got a long way to go. Specifically looking at the built environment, energy use from the building sector accounts for approximately half of the community-wide emissions in Montgomery County. When we're looking at a BEPS piece of legislation, that'll help us primarily address the commercial buildings wedge in the bottom right corner, the orange wedge down here. So by improving energy efficiency of the existing built environment, we're able to tackle about a quarter of the county's emissions. Again, they're not eliminating them, but making significant progress. So just a quick overview of BEPS. It again stands for Building Energy Performance Standard. It technically it's a policy that sets a minimum energy performance threshold for existing buildings. A number of jurisdictions across the country have started to adopt BEPS legislation. There's a number of metrics and strategies out there. We think that we found one of the way forward for BEPS policies moving for jurisdictions that follow us, so we're particularly excited about that. And that's thanks to the stakeholder work group that we engaged in late 2019 and early 2020, moving virtually when the pandemic hit. So we put these policy recommendations together, and this is a clickable link that you can look at later. It's a PDF report that's on DEP's website that informed the legislation that is in front of council today. So when we started to work on this policy, the stakeholders agreed that the key of what we're going after here is balancing flexibility for building owners with immediate action that's required for our climate emergency that we talked about earlier. As Gina has also mentioned, we approach this by making modifications to the current benchmarking law. So we added in a performance requirement. We also made some additional tweaks. We lowered the square footage threshold, so more buildings would need to enter into the benchmarking program and later into the BEPS program, and made some other minor clarifications to make it easier for building owners to digest, especially for the newer building owners that need to comply, and easier for staff at the county level to implement this. And of course, easier for Gina to help educate building owners along with us. This, of course, allows BEPS to already apply in Tacoma Park. The cities of Rockville and Gaithersburg had to make a legislative change to opt in to this section of the county code. Chapter 18A, Article 6 is the benchmarking law. Tacoma Park was already opted into that, but Rockville and Gaithersburg had to go through some legislative processes to opt in. This allows them to stay opted in. They'll have to take legislative change if they want to opt out of this law, assuming it passes. Similar to other jurisdictions that have passed BEPS, this establishes that first county status for us. We'd be the first county in the nation to establish a BEPS policy. It sets the goalposts. It defines the framework, but it doesn't necessarily have all of the complete policy baked. We plan on coming back once council approves the legislation. They have to approve the framework. Then we're going to come back and fill in the details with regulation. So the jurisdictions that have established a building energy performance center policy started with benchmarking. So I wanted to just give a brief overview about what the benchmarking law is and where it is now and what's going to be modified in that benchmarking law moving forward. So this is a law that was passed in May of 2014. It requires county and privately owned non-residential buildings that are 50,000 square feet and greater to use the Energy Star Portfolio Manager benchmarking tool. It's a free online tool offered by EPA. You collect your building characteristics and your energy data. You don't have to collect water or waste data through this platform. The county has different systems in place for waste data, and water data is not required right now. It also has a provision that was successful in the city of Chicago, so we added that element to our law. It's called data verification. It ensures that we're getting good quality data when it's reported to the county, and that building owners are able to make decisions based on that, on good quality data, not on funky estimates or anything like that. Every building owner that is covered by the law needs to report data to DEP by June 1st of every year. So that deadline has recently passed. If you are a building owner out there listening in the world that has to benchmark still and hasn't gotten that report across the finish line, just reach out to DEP and we can make sure that your building is in compliance for the year. So benchmarking at the end of the day results in building owners and managers having better data to understand what's going on in their building so that when they want to make energy upgrades, they have good information at hand to figure out what needs to be upgraded, where they need to focus their attention. And it ends up serving as that foundational component to having a beyond benchmarking policy, which is some requirement beyond just the act of benchmarking your building and disclosing it publicly. It's actually doing something a little bit additional with that information. So a beyond benchmarking. So BEPS is an iteration of those beyond benchmarking policies. So since we are amending the benchmarking law by adding in a performance standard, we thought, there's a push to add additional buildings in, but we also had the book open. We wanted to make some additional edits as well. Again, speaking to that clarity that I mentioned earlier. So currently the benchmarking law covers buildings 50,000 square feet and greater. That covers county buildings and non-residential commercial properties. There's a number of them in Tacoma Park and of course in the county. The new amendments would drop that square footage threshold down to 25,000 square feet. Made some additional modifications that buildings that would previously be exempted would no longer be exempted. Things like warehousing and self-storage. And we clarified our buildings definition and what the exemption criteria are a little bit more. So it aligns a little bit more with DC's laws in terms of getting a waiver for low occupancy, for example. But those little tweaks we think are regionally important and we think streamline the law a little bit more. But the thing that you'll notice here is that multifamily properties are new to the benchmarking law as well. Similar to the first round of benchmarking law passage, we're phasing buildings in over time. It helps us make sure that we're educating building owners in a sincere and meaningful way. We're allowing smaller building owners that maybe don't have the resources to benchmark. We're giving them a little bit more time to find those resources, to understand how to do it yourself, and make sure that they have more than enough time to come to the county and ask for help. So if you want to learn more about the benchmarking law, the link is here. We have a lot of information on our website, but if anything is unclear or you have a question that you just want answered, feel free to give us a ring. We'll make sure that you can find what you need on the website or get your questions answered. So right now, we have about 40% of the commercial area covered by the current benchmarking law. The proposed amendments would increase that to 85% of the commercial floor area in the county. You can see that the majority of that is by adding in multifamily, but then there are some other use types that by dropping the square footage threshold, we're adding them in. One key thing to note here is that because the building inventory is a bit in flux right now, and because the law hasn't quite passed, these numbers are approximate. They may change moving forward, and they may change if council makes tweaks to the current legislation as it's written. So these numbers are subject to change. Specifically in Tacoma Park, the current benchmarking law covers about 7 properties, about say 750,000 square feet. We have a pretty decent compliance rate in Tacoma Park. Back in 2019, hopefully we'll be able to update this with 2020 data soon. 86% compliance rate, considering that you only have 7 buildings that need to comply right now. That's pretty good. That would increase, as Gina mentioned earlier, compliance to 26 properties in Tacoma Park, the majority of them being multifamily properties added into the benchmarking law with this amendment. So taking a kind of a bird's eye view of BEPS policies across the country, if Montgomery County were to pass this legislation, we would be the 5th jurisdiction in the entire country to pass a building energy performance standard. Washington, D.C., just south of us, what we all know and love, has a BEPS policy in place. They've established the regulations for them, and their first compliance cycle is, I believe it's been delayed a year because of COVID, but the regulations are out, the standards are set, so they are well on their way to implement their BEPS policy in DC. But how DC did it, not necessarily what's going to work in Montgomery County. We have a bigger patchwork, a larger tapestry of building types in Montgomery County. DC is fairly uniform in their building typology. But the key takeaway on this slide, I don't want to go through every cell here. Each jurisdiction here is using a different metric. Different buildings need to comply, and there's a different compliance cycle. There's not one size fits all for this policy. Everyone's kind of feeling what works best for their jurisdiction. Not every group, every jurisdiction has an advisory board. Not every advisory board has the same powers. There's a lot of variety here. When we met with the stakeholders, we presented these options to the stakeholders and made a couple tweaks. They said, Energy Star, if we want to look long-term, Energy Star probably isn't the right metric for us. So what is the right metric for Montgomery County? So doing that stakeholder process was really helpful in determining what fits best for our building owners, our building stock, and the time frame that we want BEPS to apply. So here is, again, another bird's eye view of what Montgomery County's policy looks like. We, working with the Institute for Market Transformation and our stakeholder group, we developed what is now known as the BEPS trajectory model. And IMT, the Institute for Market Transformation, is now pitching this as the way that BEPS should be developed in other jurisdictions that follow ours. So we're really excited that we were the test bed for what is now the model policy for building performance standard policies. So what this does is it sets a long-term final standard out into the future. It gives building owners that certainty about what target they need to meet out into the future. But it gives them flexibility in how they manage their buildings. But it also sets a standard that is aligned with our climate goals. We have really aggressive climate goals. This is one of the main actions in our climate action plan that's going to help us get towards that end goal. It is not the only building action. It is not the only thing that's going to reduce emissions. There are other actions in the climate action plan that will help us get there, but this is a key component. It's a foundational component in getting our existing built environment to be more efficient. So each covered property type will get their own long-term site energy use intensity target. And so step back for a second. Energy use intensity is EUI is the shortened acronym you'll see here. It is a way that you can compare a warehouse to a laboratory. It's how efficiently you are using energy per square foot in your building. So you're able to compare high energy users to low energy users. You're able to compare very large buildings to very small buildings because it's a ratio of how efficiently your building is using energy. So using that as a metric, that is our final standard. Each building will get their own custom baseline based on their historical average energy use. So therefore, these interim standards for each building are also fairly custom to where you start on this line. So building up at the top, building A, not such a great performer, but actually probably has a lot of low-hanging fruit to get towards that final standard. Building C in this example, in this chart here, has done a lot of energy efficiency work already. It still needs to do a little bit of work to meet that standard, but it might actually be much more challenging for that already efficient building to eke out that last bit of energy savings to meet the final standard. So I think a lot of people think, oh no, you're really going after these buildings that are performing really poorly. But they actually might have a lot of low-hanging fruit that's easier for them to get that to that final standard. So same process as benchmarking. You're reporting your data every year using the Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool. Emily Curley, who's on the line here, developed these really snazzy scorecards. So building owners are still going to be getting those, getting a gut check on how well they're doing towards their next standard, their check-in point. If it's an interim standard, we'll say, hey, you're doing all right. You're reducing energy. You're on track. Good job. Or it looks like you might not meet that first target. Here are some programs and some ways that you can save energy, some programs that the Green Bank is offering or programs that the state offer through MEA. Here's some opportunities that you might want to start exploring before we get to that first interim standard. So every 4 years, buildings are evaluated against those standards to make sure that they're meeting them. And one key element that exists in our policy and we're not seeing in others yet, it was really important to the county executive to use this policy as an incentive for on-site solar installations. So we haven't totally figured that out how we're going to do that yet. We're going to come back with regulation. We have some research to do first of how to credit on-site solar against performance standards. So we want to make sure that if buildings are installing on-site solar, that they get credit for it, because we want to see more of that in Montgomery County. So that chart before looks great on paper, nice straight lines, but we understand that buildings don't operate in a straight line. They sometimes have a bumpy road down to get to an energy savings target, just due to factors beyond their control, say a tenant moving out, they might have some recapitalization for financing coming up. So there are things that are not necessarily on a straight line path that will help a building owner reduce energy. So there is kind of a release valve in the law that accounts for that. It's called a Building Performance Improvement Plan, or shortened to be a BPIP. So it's a cute little name, fun plan. So if a building is going to miss their interim or their final target, they can file a BPIP, and that would make them in compliance with the law, which is wonderful. So a BPIP would include a documentation of why they're not able to meet that target, a list of measures of how they're going to meet the next interim target or their final target, a plan for achieving those milestones, what they're going to do, when they're going to do it, and procedures for correcting any deviation from that plan. So owners that follow their BPIP, which is potentially an energy audit, list of measures and what they need to do, they would be considered in compliance with the law, which is what we want people to do. We want to see compliance, we want to see energy reductions, we want to see our greenhouse gas emissions going down. Another important element of our law is the Building Advisory Board. Other jurisdictions, I believe all besides Washington State, have this mechanism in place in their law. It is basically a convening of the regulated community and other stakeholders that are interested in BEPS or knowledgeable about industry sectors that somehow relate to BEPS. The county remains the decision-making authority, but this advisory board would recommend, provide recommendations on how to implement BEPS in Montgomery County. Similar to an already existing structure in the county, 15 voting members with 2 3-year terms, having a variety of sectors here: county leadership, building owners, utilities, energy and engineering services, finance group, NGOs, and industry representatives. They'd be tasked on advising the county on such things as those BPIPs, reviewing those and approving those, making sure that we're not being taken to town, handling unique situations like campuses or change in use type, what happens to the baseline, and once that legislation is passed at the county council, then we'll start working on putting that board together. And I'll preempt a question here. We do want to seek both industry diversity, but also locational diversity around the county. We want to make sure that not all of Down County and not all of Up County are represented. We want to make sure that we have a good variety of both locational and industry backgrounds on this group. The actual industries are included in the legislation. So this is what the law as currently written, what it looks like. There's a lot of work to be done in 2021 and 2022. We're working right now on the technical analysis to inform the regulations that we're planning on putting together. We'll be developing the groups 1 and 2 baseline. So groups 1 and 2 are buildings that are already benchmarking, but these blue and green bubbles here, those are buildings that'll be new to the benchmarking program. So they'll have 3 years of benchmarking to get comfortable with the lay of the land. What is Portfolio Manager and how do I use it, before they're given a baseline and they enter into the BEPS program. So again, that long-term standard working out for building owners. So we understand that things change. We want to be flexible, but we have this climate emergency. So out into the future, groups 1 and 2 are meeting their final standard in 2034, to be reported in 2035, with groups 3, 4, and 5 to follow, again, in that phased implementation approach. This is just a quick snapshot summary of the BEPS legislation to refer back to after this presentation. Some quick things here. The only thing I want to call out is our concerns about equity. I know that Gina mentioned that we had met with some affordable housing folks. We are conscious of the fact that the city of Tacoma Park is the only jurisdiction in the entire state that has rent stabilization. We want to make sure that we are aware of that when we are setting standards. So we know that there are some funding challenges there, and we don't want to unduly burden those building owners or the tenants that live there. So but we did feel it was important not to leave affordable housing behind. Out in New York City, they did that. They got a lot of backlash for completely exempting affordable housing. We didn't want to go down that road. Tenants of affordable housing deserve to live in healthy spaces just as much as market rate tenants, just as much as single family homeowners. And they deserve to live in high performance green buildings just like anybody else. We wanted to make sure that they got that benefit, but that they also got to benefit from the utility bill savings that come along with high performing buildings. So did want to call that out here. So in terms of next steps, our bill was sent over to council on April 1st, not a joke. It was formally introduced on May 4th. So once it was introduced, it got a bill number of its own. So the BEPS legislation is now known as Bill 1621. It might be different than the slide deck that you all have in front of you. So take out a pen, scratch this out. The public hearing was very recently scheduled for July 20th at 1:30 p.m. So any letters of support or public testimony at all, that'll be happening on July 20th at 1:30. I believe there's currently a wait list if anyone wants to testify, but that doesn't mean that council might not pick you off the wait list, or if you wanted to write something that's definitely an option as well. Following that public hearing, committee work sessions, we believe there will be multiple, and then going back to there'll be a committee vote and then a final vote in front of the full council before it's enacted. So in that time, we're not waiting for the legislation to pass. We're acting while we plan. So we're working on the data analysis in order to inform the future regulations, which as it's currently drafted, June 1st of 2022 is when those are due. So we're working on the research and background analysis that will inform those right now. We're continuing to do outreach to stakeholders, both the regulated community, the advocacy community, and of course our city jurisdictions within the county to make sure that this legislation isn't a surprise to anybody. We want to make sure that people learn about it early, they ask questions, that that this isn't the only time that they hear about it. So we hope that you'll have us back at some point when we get closer to finalizing those regulations. We'll be working on creating an advisory board and getting the materials together for that. And then one key part about this law is we want to make sure that not only are we putting out a requirement, but we are giving folks the tools that they need to be in compliance with the law. So DC has a high performance building hub, which is called the Building Innovation Hub, if folks have heard of that. We want to bring that service up to Montgomery County building owners. We think it'll be especially important as if building owners have buildings in both jurisdictions to be able to call one place to get the help they need. So we'll be working on drafting the regulations, which is a whole other process besides just doing the research, to provide that level of detail needed for having those completed by June 1st of 2022. So at the end of our presentation, we always want to point people in the right direction of how you can help, letting the county council know that you either support or hopefully don't support. If you have constructive criticism on the legislation, we definitely want council to hear constructive criticism or praise. Praise is fine too. But keep talking about BEPS with other organizations. If you are working with this community, we definitely want folks to hear about it early, and we want people to know that DEP's doors are open virtually and soon to be in person to answer questions about this law. Stay engaged with us while the regulations are being drafted. We definitely will keep doing this roadshow while that happens. If anyone here is interested in serving on the advisory board, let us know. Doesn't look like there's a chat here, but if you send us an email afterwards, we'll put you on an interested party list. And then if there are folks out there who own and operate buildings in Montgomery County or the city of Tacoma Park, start looking at ways to upgrade your buildings, get ahead of the curve. There are great incentives offered through the utility company. Both Pepco and Washington Gas offer Empower Maryland incentives. The great part about those are prescriptive and custom rebates. There's retro commissioning or building tune-up rebates. And then one of our favorites is the staff operations and maintenance training for facility managers that are operating buildings, that they're able to get discounted training on how to better operate their buildings. It's really exciting. MEA also offers grants and other programs at the state level. And then, of course, our favorite, the Montgomery County Green Bank, has a variety of programs. And if you haven't been to their website recently, definitely check them out. They have a ton of new offerings for small businesses, folks who are looking for solar PPA financing. There's a wide variety of different programs that can suit building owners' needs. And with that, I'm going to take a sip of water, and then we will answer questions. But if you come up with a question right after we close the Zoom, you feel free to email us there. Our email addresses are at the back of the slide deck. So I'm going to end the slideshow, and I guess maybe I'll turn it over to Gina to field questions. I feel like that's appropriate, but you let me know, Gina.
Yeah, I am happy to field the questions. I think most of them will likely be for you.
Great.
Well, if you want to call on people, it looks like Cindy has her hand raised.
Yeah.
Good, Cindy. You want to ask the first question?
Thank you. So thanks so much for this. This is really great progress on a very important tool, both for the city and the county in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As the city picture is similar to the county picture. About half is buildings, about half is other stuff. And within the half, about half is commercial and half is residential. So it got my attention that you think this is a very critical tool for moving us forward. I do have a couple of questions on a broader level. So the first one is, I heard you showed DC, and you noted that they have 10,000 square foot limit on their buildings, not 50 or 25,000. Do we know whether Prince George's County is moving in this direction? And the reason I ask is because we're starting to have critical mass in a big swath of the DC metro area for building owners across the board.
So I will say that Prince George's County does not have a benchmarking law at this time.
Right.
And so it's hard to have a building energy performance standard layered on top if they don't have a benchmarking law. So that would be the first step, is if they wanted to have something like this, to have that regional coordination and consistency across jurisdictional borders, got to start with a benchmarking policy. But of course, if they are interested, we chat with them here and there. We, of course, happy to help educate. And I know that the DC crew as well would be happy to have that conversation.
So I noticed that you phased it in, and you made a point of saying that that you are aware of rent stabilization in Tacoma Park, and you want to factor that into the development of the standards for those types of buildings, and that's great. What kinds of resources will the county be able to provide or push building owners to? Because of rent stabilization, there's some very specific rules about what building owners can and cannot spend and pass on to rent, and there's some very strict limits about rent. So there's not the same kind of return on investment that there would be with other types of buildings, commercial buildings on New Hampshire Avenue, et cetera. So I'm really concerned about, I think this is really important, and I'm concerned about the equity aspect of this.
We are too. And I will say up front that Stan, Emily, and I are not affordable housing experts. We certainly would like to be, and we have a lot to learn. And so we are starting to have those conversations and bring those people to the table, just so that we don't have unintended consequences in this policy, which, Cindy, is definitely what you're getting at. So I want to answer your first question about resources. So the first thing, the Building Innovation Hub that's down in DC is a convener. They're an information provider. They speak a different language than policymakers, such that building owners are a little bit more receptive to what they're saying. They provide a very key resource in the DC BEPS implementation. They're providing training. They're going to where building owners are congregating, to where they normally meet, and educating them about what BEPS is and what resources are there. So we'd like to bring that first into Montgomery County, so that we have that kind of consistency. Secondly, we do have an interest in providing a more direct technical assistance effort for building owners, not necessarily just affordable housing, but building owners where, like, even benchmarking is a bridge too far sometimes. I think that folks in the know of building policy are, benchmarking is just kind of a given. It's not a given for all. So we want to make sure that we offer some sort of assistance to them, a little bit more of a direct handhold. And then, of course, we're partnering with the Montgomery County Green Bank to make sure that we're doing outreach right now, but making sure that we have programs tailored specifically for them, for building owners that are like, I need to make upgrades to my building and I don't know where to start. The Green Bank is a good first phone call to make, because they have a contractor network. They have a variety of lenders that they work with. And I know that, I believe it was one of the first Green Bank deals was actually in Tacoma Park. Yep. Super exciting. I'm actually going to turn Q&A over to Stan and Emily for a hot second because my 1-year-old is having a really hard time with bedtime. I will be back in a very short amount of time.
The
Thank you.
1-year-old hates to miss a BEPS presentation. So
I know she loves them. She
Put her
really
to
does.
sleep.
just to add on to what Lindsay said about affordable housing. So when we've met with Gaithersburg, Rockville, you folks in Tacoma Park, when we met with council members prior to introduction of the actual legislation, everybody raised the issue of affordable housing. So it's definitely on everybody's radar screen. And we recognize, and the people who will ultimately adopt the policy recognize that that's something that's important to look at. We're very interested in addressing our climate issues, but we're not interested in addressing our climate issues at the expense of housing issues. So we need to make sure those policies work hand in hand. And we don't have all the answers yet, but it's right up there at the top of our list of things to make sure we address.
Great, thank you. And so speaking of smaller, less capable, perhaps, building owners, so you said that in Tacoma Park, this will cover 16 multifamily buildings. That's about half of the ones that are 10,000 square foot or 20 units and above. So that leaves another 18 or 20 dropping down to the DC level iteration of 10,000 square feet. I would be so bold as to suggest that there might be a pilot program in here where we start with benchmarking for buildings in that size range. We somehow work together on that piece before we tackle the performance standards. Because as you've made clear, first you have to know what the energy use is. And to do that, you have to work with the building owners and they have to understand how to do all that. And then move to building standards. So I'm just going to throw that out there. And I think for now, I'll let other people speak. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you for the
Next, we
question.
have Councilman Searcy.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Your presentation was great. And I appreciate the need to do a deeper dive into affordable housing issues. I think one of the things that's challenging, particularly in my ward, I have 2 large affordable housing apartments complexes that are both at different stages of addressing some of the energy efficiency issues that they have. And the infrastructure is very old, extremely old, which means it's extremely costly to upgrade. And so when we're talking about some of the funding sources that may be available, we're talking more about financing, and they're too large to apply to certain types of grants. And it gets really messy when they're already in some really deep waters in terms of financing. I would definitely encourage at the county level, providing grant funds available and expecting it to be not a $5,000 grant, because that does nothing for a 200 unit building that has been dealing with a boiler from the 70s. And that's just, those are just facts. We have a very old housing stock. So, that's something that we would definitely encourage speaking to in terms of, because I think what you've described here with BIPs is great. I think just in a practical sense, as different property owners are struggling to upgrade their units, the devil is in the details, and the details are in the dollars. And where are they?
Right.
So I think that's something that's going to be really important to keep in mind. Another thing that came to mind while you were speaking was about the solar credits and the solar aspects of things. And, that's another issue that we're talking through because the city of Tacoma Park has a pretty strong tree ordinance here, which sometimes creates a conflict with solar installation. And so I don't know to what degree, the county executive has had any conversations with you all around tree canopy goals versus, some of these new building performance initiatives, which might cause us as a city to rethink some of our tree policies to allow for that flexibility for some of our larger property owners to be able to take advantage of some of those solar credits that you all are interested in incentivizing. Has there been any discussions about that at all, or?
We haven't gotten down to the specifics about how BEPS and tree policies might intersect, but that's another great example of, in this climate debate, how you've got sort of competing priorities. Nobody wants to cut down trees. Everybody wants solar, but sometimes, as you've highlighted, those two things don't go together. So we're looking at solar. One of the interesting aspects about solar is there are different ways to do it, right? You can put solar on your own building. There are other ways to access solar, through community solar, through purchase of renewable energy credits from solar installations outside of the jurisdiction even. And all those things have some complexities to them, and all of them have some pros and cons. And that's another thing we're looking at. We're excited to try to promote solar on buildings in the county, but we recognize that's not a one size fits all. Just like a BEPS policy can't be a one size fits all for every building. So again, another area we're trying to work out. We've got a contract that we're entering into with a consultant through COG to help us study the whole solar aspect of BEPS. That'll be going on through the summer, and as we finalize the regulations, we'll incorporate those things into our policy. But we certainly recognize Tacoma Park, with its strong tree policies, there's conflicts there. But nobody in the county favors cutting down trees to put up solar, and we don't favor that either. Trees provide so many benefits that we have to find a way to make those two things coexist. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I just was going to say a theme you'll see here is that we are very upfront about a lot of the details here. We still need to work out, and these are very helpful conversations that we have, because people highlight issues for us that help clarify some of the thinking we have to do, and that'll be ongoing until we adopt the regulations that support this policy.
Yeah, I was just going to add on your first point about affordable housing and this old, outdated equipment. One thing we haven't mentioned is kind of policy mechanisms to also help for specific building types. So for affordable housing, what you described might be great for a BPIP, right? So, I don't have the financing, I don't have the money to replace the system now, but when I do, in a year or two, when it goes out, I'm going to find the most efficient, new boiler to add. And in that case, that's what we want. We could work with the builder to do that. Similarly for affordable housing, we know there's, specific times when capital is available. So if you're refinancing or recapitalizing the project, we might just need to come up with some different policy mechanisms for those, different types of housing, different types of buildings where, we understand it's just not going to make sense to put them on a 5-year plan when they're, doing in a 12 or 15 or 20-year recapitalization. So we'll just have to work that flexibility in, I think.
Great, thank you.
Great, Councilmember Kovar.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. Really interesting, and really appreciate hearing all about it. I do just want to follow on briefly with what my two colleagues talked about in terms of the affordable housing question, because to me, ultimately, it doesn't feel like it's something where it could just be, let's build more flexibility into it. No affordable housing anywhere ever gets built without the government being involved in subsidizing it in some way. And so I don't think in the long run it will be realistic to say, we'll give them a few more years. This has to be like everything else is with affordable housing. The government has to help finance it. And so I just think that's how it's going to have to be, because none of the other things will get us to the goal. And I think it's further complicated because in some cases, in Ward 1, which I represent, the main apartment building there is federally subsidized. In other places in the city, sometimes it's just rent stabilization, which is in a sense a form of subsidy, but in other cases, it's the county or the state being involved. So each of those will be different, but I think it has to be worked into there in some way. And if you think about the percentage that you had in the pie chart, so roughly 50% of it, if I remember the number right, was from buildings of different sizes, and we're not talking about getting into all of that. And then 42% or whatever the number was from transportation. And Councilmember Duvall mentioned it's very similar to the Tacoma Park numbers. On a lot of transportation fixes, people sort of get that. You do transit when it's time to buy your next car, maybe you buy an electric car. Either there are big projects already and that's how it's going to be done, or consumers kind of understand it. I think people are way behind where they are on those things in terms of understanding the ways that I don't think most people have a clue that 50% of greenhouse gases are just caused by buildings that they think of as just the buildings just sitting there. What do they have to do with it? And of course, they do understand that using fossil fuels as opposed to solar or something else would be different. But I think so that educational part of it is really big. And I was wondering, and maybe after that long speech, I'll ask a question. Sorry about that. The state legislature just did approve the legislation for the community choice energy here in the county. How do you all see that meshing with this? Because it does seem as if that would be an important part of this.
Yeah, I think all those the community choice energy policy and the building efficiency policy work together. We certainly want to reduce the amount of energy that's used in individual buildings, and we want to make sure that energy that's used is decarbonized. So again, those two things will go together. Just with respect to your earlier statement about affordable housing and delaying things or providing, we recognize that it's not just a delay, it's not just technical assistance. There's going to have to be some, it's not just financing, because some places can't finance it. There's going to have to be some money in as part of this mix. And the other challenging thing about affordable housing, of course, is that affordable housing isn't just one entity. There are many different types of affordable housing, from federally subsidized affordable housing up to market rate for affordable housing. And so I'm not market rate, naturally occurring affordable housing. And so we have to figure out how to address all those. They're all important. They all serve some sector of the community. And so it's going to have to be a mix of a lot of different things. In some cases, a delay until they are recapitalizing under a normal recapitalization process, and they have to replace equipment anyway, that may be enough. But in other cases, that's not going to be enough. So we recognize, and that's why the BPIP approach and the building improvement board that can evaluate certain situations and make decisions building by building if necessary is a critical part of our program. And we think that long range target and all those methods in there will help us.
So would the board actually be a decision-making entity or just an advisory board? Right. The board will be in Montgomery County. The board will be an advisory board. The ultimate authority will rest with the county, but we certainly want to make sure that board is staffed with people that are making solid, technically based and financially based recommendations to us, so that we're making decisions based on the best available information. Okay. And just one other question, and maybe people who work on this more often than I do know the answer already to this, but if this really started to expand to more and more buildings, is there any sort of concern that you need a lot more trained workers to do the work, and you need more technology to be available, and you need more supply chains or whatever it is? Is that a concern, or is that actually a great job creation opportunity, or is it kind of both? Or how do you see that? I think we tend to look at it as a great opportunity. We recognize that it could be a concern if there aren't enough trained staff, if supplies are limited, but we look at that as a real economic development opportunity in the county, because this is work that can't be outsourced. It's done on site in buildings. So we think there's real opportunities there. It has to be paired with some workforce training, perhaps. And one of the things we're also working on as part of our climate activities, you may know that the county council just directed the Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation to develop a new economic development strategy for the county. And we inserted ourselves into that process and said, this economic development plan has to have climate and equity as primary goals. And so we're going to be working with them, with MCEDC, to develop that plan. We hope we have a consultant that's doing some research for us on developing an equitable economy, which includes
local job development and training. And so we're hopeful that this is a real opportunity.
Great. Well, I'll just say I've been a big advocate for making sure at our level, and it makes sense at your level also, to have racial equity initiative and economic development and affordable housing and climate change all kind of mesh together, because they can be mutually reinforcing if it's done in the right way.
Yes.
And thank you. I appreciate the presentation and the answers.
Councilman Costick?
Thank you very much for the presentation and all the question and answers so far. It's been really informative and I think helpful to kind of get a very thorough understanding of this. So thank you very much. I think overall this is exciting and I like the direction this is going in. I do share some of the concerns that my colleagues raised with regard to affordable housing and equity considerations, and I'm glad to see that's something that you all are taking into consideration as you think through this. I just wanted to kind of raise two sort of other kind of semi-unique flags that kind of popped up to me as I was looking at this, and one was just the institutional buildings that aren't necessarily multifamily, but aren't commercial, straight commercial uses for maybe nonprofits or religious institutions, schools. It looks like one of the properties that's on the list for Tacoma Park is in my ward and includes a daycare center. So I would envision that their situation might be a little more unique with regard to how they finance and manage some of the changes that would be needed. So I'm curious if you've given that side of things a little bit of thought. And then my other question was about properties where there is a complex of housing units that are all owned by the same owner and kind of managed as a group, but individually might not meet the threshold for the 25 or 50,000. And obviously in those cases too, I would imagine it would be a much greater amount of money that the owners would have to undertake to potentially anyway, to make updates to multiple buildings within that complex. I have a property in Ward 3 that is like that. And I'm sure there are some others around the city as well. So I think whether they're included in this or not, it seems like some outreach to those properties would be particularly useful.
Yeah. So I'm going to let Emily address the building question because we spent a lot of time looking at building definitions and who's covered. So she can go that to address your first point about what I would call under-resourced buildings in addition to affordable housing. So nonprofits, houses of worship, some institutional properties, some small business owned buildings. We recognize those might be under-resourced challenge sectors. In those same tools that we would apply to affordable housing, we would look to apply to those buildings and give them special attention because we do recognize not every building in the county, contrary to some people's opinion, is a market rate commercial office space that can charge whatever rents they can charge to cover this. So we do in the law, we recognize those sectors specifically. We call them out along with affordable housing as building types that we'll want to pay special attention to.
Yeah, and I guess on your question about properties where there might be multiple buildings. So how we've rewritten the law is that, so currently if you have multiple buildings on one parcel, the whole parcel is covered by benchmarking and you have to report all those buildings, whether you report them as kind of one building or split them up is up to the owner. So we're changing the definition to now only be based on a building basis, I guess with one caveat, which is that if those buildings still share a system or share energy meters, those would still be considered as basically one building for the purposes of coverage and would be kind of moved along the program together, right, from benchmarking and BEPS. And part of the reason for that is also how utility incentives are levied, right? So in a master metered building, for instance, there's different incentives available than like individually metered properties. Or if there's, say a shared boiler, that's an opportunity to upgrade something for the complex so that all the buildings would kind of benefit from that. And, that's something that we would document on the campus level. So it does get kind of wonky with those differences, but yeah, hopefully where we are considering a complex to be more as one building, they would have some of those shared opportunities to do more of those blanket upgrades.
The only thing that I'll add on to that is that to your point earlier about some buildings have multiple uses in them. I think that your question was geared more towards how do those different types of owners pay for things. But I do want to just highlight that in our development of the standards, we are looking at a weighted area by property use type standard for mixed use buildings. So if you happen to have a grocery store on the first floor of a multifamily building, those two space types would have different targets. So that building owner in the end would get a custom target based on what use types are in their building. A daycare center is not necessarily going to get just the daycare center, overall, when they might operate as something else. We are taking that into consideration. We know there's a large amount of mixed use properties in the county, and that comes with its own challenges too. So that you have a variety of building types in there and systems. A grocery store uses different systems than a multifamily building. So we're trying to be conscious of that as well when we're working on this policy.
Thank you very much.
I'm on mute, sorry. I'm not seeing any other hands. I did have a question in, Councilman Dybala. Did you?
Sorry.
And then Councilmember Kovar. So I spoke too soon. There are lots of hands still.
Yeah, sorry. One more round. It's just, so I wanted to come back for a minute to the different levels, 50,000, 25,000, 10,000. And I know that you considered 10,000 square feet county. Well, I don't know this. I think that you considered it county-wide. And given the complexity of doing this program, I could see why you didn't. But would you be, what was your thinking about doing it down county where there are a lot more of these older energy inefficient buildings that are somewhat smaller? That's equity in a different way, right? It's reaching more people who live down county with this program. So I wanted to see what your thoughts are on the 25,000 versus DC's 10,000 square foot threshold. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. DC did a significant amount of research on their building stock before they set that 10,000 square foot number. And we looked at that research and we did our own analysis of the information we had about the building stock. We have a quarter of the staff that DC does. So in all reality, it's a staff bandwidth issue. We don't have the bandwidth to go down to 10,000 square feet. But if you look at the energy profile there, we might be tapping a lot of building owners and not actually get that much both square footage or estimated energy use when we're looking at going down to a lower square footage number. So it would be a lot of additional effort for not that much additional benefit, climate or energy wise. So even going down to, sorry to cut you off.
You're talking countywide.
Countywide, yes. And we wanted to keep the county uniform in the requirements that we're putting into this policy so that Rockville isn't different from Tacoma Park, isn't different from Up County. It just makes it much more challenging to enforce a law like that or educate building owners that you get mixed messaging and it becomes very challenging to have conversations, especially if one building owner has buildings all over the county. That person may have different requirements to meet based on where their building is, it ends up being very challenging. So it is the juice worth the squeeze type of conversation. Even going down to 25,000 square feet, we're touching more building owners. So there is some investment there and benefits. We're not actually tapping into as much square footage or estimated energy use. Adding in multifamily is really the big hitter with these amendments. The square footage is not not as impactful as you might think. There's a lot of energy use in larger buildings, and we're already capturing them in the benchmarking law.
And our experience has been as you go lower, you get greater variability in building systems and you get less sophistication in the building owners, less knowledge, less building automation systems and things like that to understand their building use. So at this point, we felt 25,000 was the right cutoff.
And that doesn't mean that we can't do outreach and work with those building owners if they want information. We've offered to do voluntary programs. It ends up being a bandwidth issue, just because it's myself and Emily and Stan. We're the commercial energy team, essentially.
And certainly the financing, the Empower Maryland incentives, those are all available to those smaller buildings. So there are opportunities for them to implement improvements if they choose.
Right, and of course, they're the folks who on average, most need the help in order to access that stuff, which is why I was asking, because from our point of view, we have a lot of those buildings, and that's true in Silver Spring. It's true in a lot of more urban areas of the county. Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Kovar.
Well, I'm on a second round, so if you wanted to ask something first, I don't want to jump in.
I can close this out. It's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I just had one other area that I wanted to ask about, and it's something that I hear a lot from people thinking about it theoretically anyway, I suppose, and that relates to the question that was just asked and the answer on this idea of how mandatory versus voluntary should it be, depending on the size and so on. And so there's really two parts to it. Obviously, if you had lots and lots more staff, you're sort of suggesting you could do more. But if you don't, is the percentage that you capture, 85% of commercial, and I guess a lot less for residential, is it enough to enable the county to get to the goal you want to? And then the other question I had that's sort of related is, and something I hear from people all the time, well, how can they tell us what to do? And so what's the legal or constitutional angle to this too? And maybe that's something that a lawyer should answer instead, but I figure I'd toss it out there.
So we work with the county attorney's office to develop this policy. So we're confident that we have the legal authority to implement BEPS. They don't hesitate to tell us when we don't have the authority to do something. So, will it be enough to reach our goals? Well, our goal is 0. So no, this policy in and of itself obviously won't be sufficient to reach our policy. It's a key component. As the county executive says when he talks about our 0 goal by 2035, we wanted to be aspirational. The council wanted to be aspirational when they set that. We recognize that in some areas we may fall short, but we're gonna take a run at some of the most aggressive policies we can come up with. Again, balancing these issues we've talked about affordable housing and availability of funding. All these things are going to be challenges as we implement every aspect of the climate plan. But if you don't set those aspirational goals, you're definitely going to fall short.
But so then if people are, for example, in some way or other purchasing credits or in one of these programs where, well, it may not be their actual energy coming from wind or solar, but from a collectively designed plan that they can say that the amount they use comes from that. Is that acceptable as part of what you're doing?
So that's something we're looking at with respect to the solar policy. I mean, that's a question we have to wrestle with. So we've talked about a little bit about community choice energy. And I think under community choice energy, some people think that that means the county's going to go out and build a bunch of renewable generating facilities within the county.
Right.
That's just not feasible. We're going to be buying renewable energy certificates or entering into contracts for the purchase of power and certificates from resources outside the county. The goal is to, as you said, to make sure that our energy use in the county is offset somewhere, whether it's from a climate standpoint. It doesn't matter whether you reduce your emissions in the county or in some other state that might have the wind resources or the solar resources that we could utilize. So those are still issues we're wrestling with. Some people do not. They want all the power to be generated in the county, the electrons that come to a particular building or home to be clean electrons. That's just not feasible with the way our power system's set up right now, with the location of our generating resources and the way our grid's set up. But if we can reduce the equivalent amount of emissions, reduce emissions equivalent to the amount of energy we use, then from a climate perspective, that's our goal.
Thank you.
Great. Anyone else? No? I had a question. This may be covered under other areas, but if we have buildings that are going under, like renovations, actually, Councilman Searcy has one in her ward, and there are a number of them. Where do those kind of, if somebody is like undertaking a big project to renovate a building, where do they fall into all of this? In terms of the timing and everything. Because I would imagine if you're investing in, right, in renovating something and doing all that, you kind of don't want to do it again or redo something. So where does that fall into all of this?
That's a really good question. And so I'm assuming that in this major renovation, you would be going through permitting services. You're bringing the entire building up to code.
Yeah.
That brings up another element that we're thinking about with this policy, is such that you're bringing a building up to current building code. We don't want to set you up for failure when the building becomes an existing building and has to then comply with BEPS. So that is something that when we are setting the standards, we want to make sure that there isn't a conflict there. But also, you're taking an existing building and doing a major retrofit. Say that might actually help your energy goals at the end of the day. That could be the thing that gets you to meet that target. But say you're doing a major retrofit, but then you're also changing the use type of your building. That's something that the advisory board would weigh in on. They're looking at the building to say, wow, you were a multifamily building and now you've renovated it into a bunch of offices. You have a substantially different use type. What are we going to do with your building in this long range planning cycle? Do we give you a couple of years to set a new baseline and then you go from there? We don't quite have that figured out yet, but I believe that unique situations like that are exactly why we have an advisory board built into the law.
One of the other aspects of our climate work that we're working on is with respect to building codes to moving toward net zero buildings, both on the commercial and residential side. And that would include major renovations. They would have to go through the permitting process and they would apply. So as Lindsay said, we want to make sure those requirements for new buildings are staying ahead of where the BEPS policy is, so we don't set someone up to fail down the road. Yep.
Which brings up the question of what is the timing about the county council on the green building code revisions, the IGCC proposal?
That's a good question. I don't think we want to speak for the county council. They have the regulations. We're hopeful they will move on them quickly, but I wouldn't want to hazard a guess for when the council will act.
Okay, because that's another policy that is a county policy that is very important to the city of Tacoma Park's meeting its climate targets, as is this building performance standard policy.
Yeah.
And I'd also add on to that the IECC, which is the energy code. Beyond adding, you add the green code on top of the energy code, but there's plans to use the energy code as part of that net zero strategy. So I think that that's as important, if not more so, than the current IGCC, just because that's where there's a lot of flexibility for building owners, but also you can get the hammer hits the nail on that one.
Thank you.
Great. Well, all my other points were raised by my colleagues. That's the benefit of going last. And I do just want to round up and say that we really do appreciate, we will be writing a letter as the council. I didn't realize that there was already a waiting list for public testimony, but maybe they'll let a mayor sneak in. And we just want to thank you. I know we've raised some concerns tonight that you've heard from other places, but I don't want that to dampen our enthusiasm, honestly, for the work that you all have been doing on these efforts. Benchmarking buildings was part of the resolution that we passed. It's something that we've discussed. And so we're really excited that you all have been doing a lot of the hard work, and this is coming before the county council. And as Councilman Dabala said, we still have a lot of buildings that we hope to provide assistance to here in Tacoma Park, but it's great to have this as a first step. So thank you very much for your help, and we will be submitting a letter this summer. So thank you.
Great. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
the opportunity to present. We appreciate it.
Great. All right. I think that's it for us this evening. Thank you to our sustainability manager, Gina Mathias, and we will have our regularly scheduled meeting on Wednesday night at 7:30. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. We're adjourned.
Thank you.